Hi everyone, welcome to Chapter 9. In Chapter 9 we're going to start our region of Sub-Saharan Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa, it's again one of those regions that a lot of people don't know a lot about, especially Americans and Westerners. They often think of pictures that you see here. This is an elephant in Kruger National Park in South Africa. But we're going to talk about kind of dispelling some of those images that we might have of sub-Saharan Africa that are kind of homogenous, when in reality it is an incredibly diverse place. And the way that sub-Saharan Africa is often portrayed in the media is either kind of images of kind of tribal life, such as the one you see here, or war, or poverty. And what we're going to learn is Africa, sub-Saharan Africa is a lot more than that, including things like soccer stadiums and cities and technology and food and fashion. Your exercise in this module is going to be looking at a Twitter hashtag that went around last year that some people are still kind of adding onto, that's called the Africa the Media Never Shows Us. So kind of dispelling these homogenous views of this really large and diverse region as this kind of just place that's all war-torn and full of poverty. And one of the things that I really want to stress, we're in a geography class and it's really important to understand this, because this is another mistake that a lot of people made. Africa is not a country. Africa is a continent with many, many countries. So again, Africa is not a country. Africa is not a country. On your exam, I'm going to ask you this question because I want you to understand that Africa it is not a country. It is a continent. We talked a little bit about North Africa when we talked about the Middle East and North Africa because it's culturally more similar to the Middle East. But now we're talking about sub-Saharan Africa. And so we want to talk about how we define the region of sub-Saharan Africa. It's all the countries that you see colored here, plus South Sudan. This map is a little bit old, but South Sudan has broken off from Sudan and it is part of this region, while the Sudan is part of the Middle East and North Africa. So that sub in sub-Saharan Africa literally just means south of the Sahara Desert. And there are cultural, economic distinctions from North Africa, right? That big desert kind of blocks a lot of cultural exchange between these regions. It is less developed than North Africa. It is also not Arab, unlike North Africa. And so the big question is, why is sub-Saharan Africa so poor? If we look at the rating of the Human Development Index, and again, remember 1 is a perfect score, this is our lowest ranking region at 0.423 of an average, compared to 0.8 of Europe, even the Middle East, 0.6, South and East Asia, 0.6, right? 0.423 is quite low. And so throughout this module and this region, we're going to talk about what factors help us figure out why. And so for the rest of this part of the part 1 lecture, and you'll get parts 2 and 3 in the next module, we're going to talk mostly about the physical geography and how that has contributed to this region not being as wealthy as regions like Europe. And so when we look at the physical landscape of the region, there's a huge area, right? A really, really large continent, but a relatively short coastline. Remember, Europe has a pretty small area, but lots and lots of coastline. It's a peninsula of peninsulas. But it's actually pretty hard to reach the interior. There are few mountains in sub-Saharan Africa, and so subsequently there are a few rivers, which I'll talk about in a second. It's at a very low latitude, so it has a lot of equatorial climate in tropics that can not be as mild as those in places like Europe. Little snowfall due to the fact that it is equatorial and there's few mountains. And there's also relatively fewer rivers than most other regions. And the rivers that do exist differ in some important ways. And remember, rivers start at higher elevations, so if you get few mountains, you're going to get fewer rivers. And again, I just want to stress how large this region is, especially compared to its coastline. Right? You can fit the US, China, India, Eastern Europe, Italy, Germany, France, Spain, Belgium, Netherlands, and the UK just in the size of Africa alone. Really, really big region, but a relatively short coastline. And so when we look at Africa's landscape, um, if we talk about plate tectonics, we have no convergent boundaries that are happening here. We have a divergent one, but that means that we're not getting any of that tectonic uplift in order to form any mountains. You can see the plains of the Sahel region up there on the left. We do have some mountains in South Africa and Lesotho, but relatively small. And then we have the highlands of Ethiopia, which actually is on a divergent boundary. So you get the Great Rift Valley, where you're getting a pulling apart of the African and the Arab plate. And so when we look at Africa's rivers, there are several really long rivers, including the Zambezi and the Congo, but they are often not navigable. And so I showed you in Europe this picture of a port that's really far inland. Africa's rivers are shallow, wide often, have waterfalls that are obstructions. So they are not rivers that you can travel down easily in order to reach the interior or ship goods back and forth. Oops, sorry. And so here we can see the Kariba Dam on the Zambezi River. Dams are also hard to do in the region due to those peculiar rivers that they have there. And again, when we look at sub-Saharan Africa compared to the United States, equatorial, much lower latitude, much larger area. And when we talk about the climate of the region, we have this huge span of latitude that is never very far from the equator, but a pretty significant difference from that boundary of the Sahara all the way down to South Africa. We have symmetrical patterns of climate on either side of the equator. And that intertropical convergent zone that I talked about way back when, which is this band of low pressure that fluctuates back and forth north and south of the equator, just north and south of the equator, has a huge impact on weather and climate there. And I'll show you an example of that in a minute. But on the equator, we have a climate that's rainy year-round. And then when we get away from the equator, just a little bit, we get a rainy summer and a dry winter. And again, remember, summer for the northern hemisphere, June, July, August. In the southern hemisphere, it's when we are having our winter. And then a band down from that, that's dry year-round. Here we have the border of the savanna. Oops. And we do have, as we get farther away, a little clip of Mediterranean in South Africa that looks a lot like San Diego does, and Orange County, right? Kind of very similar vegetation styles, very mild weather. And so there are three major vegetation types in the region that correlate with this climate. And this map is a little bit incorrect, but it displays the purpose for us. So you have tropical rainforest, savanna, right, and tropical deciduous forest are the three big ones. We also have desert on either side. But those three major vegetation types all have problems for agricultural productivity and therefore developed. Right? When we talked back at the beginning of the semester why some places were more developed than others, the ability to grow food has a lot to do with it. And so when we look at rainforests, which are on the equator near the Congo, we have these trade winds that are coming from the coast that are bringing lots and lots of moisture in, lots of plants, but really poor soils that are not good for farming. So one of the ways that people combat that is the slash and burn agriculture, where you burn down the vegetation in order to clear it, but also to give some nutrients to the soil, and then grow crops on it. The thing about slash and burn agriculture is it can work well on a small scale, but if you keep repeatedly do it on a larger scale, there are diminishing returns, which means you're not going to get as much out of the land as you keep doing that. Then we have the savannas, which have these very stark wet and dry seasons. So in the dry season, this is the wet season here, we have a watering hole in Kruger National Park in South Africa. It's the beginning of the dry season here, but during the dry season, all of this grass would be quite yellow. It would be much, much drier. And so you have a wet summer and a dry winter, and everything is adapted to survive that drought season. And most of those animals are doing that via migration. They're following that retreating savanna back and forth as it goes. But without irrigation in the savanna, agriculture is pretty limited because the dry season is pretty dry. Then we have the Sahel, which is the Sahara Savanna boundary. And primarily here we have pastoralists who are herding livestock here. You can see a person there down on the right with goats. So basically, your livestock is eating that vegetation. You're traveling around to get that vegetation, but as population grows, you'll have more and more herds, and then you're going to get less vegetation from those herds eating that vegetation. The water cycle gets interrupted. You're going to be able to hold less moisture without that vegetation. So the Sahara Desert here is actually growing southward through a process called desertification. Which is also not great for the people who live there, and certainly not great for population growth and development. So again, that process is called desertification. And my last slide for the class is just about the incredible diversity of wildlife in the region, especially large animals, large game animals. We have lost just about all of our large game here in the United States. Mainly they need large ranges to roam, most of them. We still obviously have deer and a little bit of buffalo, but Africa has an incredible diversity, but those habitats are now under threat from population growth, mostly through agriculture. Right? So as people are trying to grow more food, they're encroaching in on these animals' habitats, and also it's leading to confrontations with animals when they're coming onto these farms. So animals are under threat from targeted killings due to this kind of conflict that's right on these human borders with agriculture, but also poaching, not just for food, but also luxury animal products. This has been a problem with elephant tusks and rhinoceros horns. Some of these things are considered in other countries, mostly in East Asia, to have medicinal properties. And so they can be hunted sustainably. There are plenty of nature reserves that kind of operate on selling these very, very expensive hunting permits, in very, very few of them, that will allow you to come on the land and hunt a line per se, and then they use that money in order to fund these nature reserves. So you can kind of have sustainable hunting here, but these animals are also a very valuable asset while alive. All of these pictures were taken in Kruger National Park, and a lot of people will pay a lot of money to come and see these guys outside doing their thing. And so that's the end of Chapter 9, Part 1. You're now going to move on to your exercise for this module, and we'll see you in the next module.